Imagine the framework of your entire life just, well, collapsing.
Right. Just completely gone.
Exactly. The rules of engagement vanish.
Yeah.
Your command structure is gone. You are isolated in a cell, and you're held by individuals who, frankly, do not recognize the laws of war.
Yeah. They operate entirely outside the boundaries of human restraint.
And every instinct tells you to fight, right? To resist with violence, to rely on the combat training that has defined your entire career.
But if you rely on that training in this specific environment, you won't survive.
No, you will be executed. So how do you adapt? I mean, how do you behave when the system that built you is just stripped away?
Well, the United States military actually has an algorithm for that.
Which is fascinating.
Yeah.
You are stepping into a deep dive today. It's an audit, really, of systemic compliance, operational risk, and the behavioral architecture of the human weapon.
Right.
Today, we are opening up the Blue Suit files to decode the exact expectations placed on a mid-level manager within the military apparatus.
And our objective for this deep dive is a rigid clinical analysis of the Airman development and testing chart. Specifically, we're targeting Chapter 19 of Air Force Handbook 1, which is the Standards of Conduct.
So, how do we even begin to audit this?
Well, the parameters of this audit are strictly defined by the required comprehension level. The Air Force, it doesn't assess all knowledge equally.
Right, there's a matrix.
Exactly. If you analyze the testing matrix for Chapter 19, which covers Section 19A on the way of life, Section 19B on the law of war, and Section 19C on the code of conduct, the required comprehension level for a technical sergeant is universally designated as Level B.
Okay, wait, so we need to define exactly what Level B mandates before we dissect the text.
We do. So the system categorizes Level A as remembering. Level A is the domain of pure fact retrieval.
Like rote memorization.
Yeah, exactly. Dates, aircraft nomenclature, historical figures, checklists. It's basically just data storage.
Okay, and then what about Level C?
Level C, conversely, is applying. That dictates the actual physical or tactical execution of procedures in real-world scenarios.
I see. So Level B sits right between them.
Right. It is defined clinically as understanding.
Let's isolate that definition for a second. Understanding means constructing meaning, interpreting, exemplifying, classifying, summarizing, inferring, comparing, or explaining.
It's a heavy lift.
It really is. For a technical sergeant, the system doesn't merely require the regurgitation of a regulation, and it doesn't test them solely on executing a tactical maneuver in a vacuum.
No, it requires the comprehension of the relationships between these regulations.
Right? It demands the capacity to interpret a rule and then explain the causal link between that rule and the survival of the entire organization.
It is the cognitive bridge between the ink on the page and the reality of the operational environment.
Yeah.
A technical sergeant must understand the underlying architecture of these directives to effectively translate them to subordinates. You have to grasp the logic of the system.
Because the consequence of a failure in Level B comprehension isn't simply, a failed promotion test.
Oh, absolutely not. Or a poor performance review. The consequence is a systemic breakdown in good order and discipline.
And that breakdown leads directly to operational failure, legal prosecution under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, international incidents, or, the loss of human life.
It's high stakes. So we will approach Chapter 19 as a behavioral schematic. It outlines the programming of an airman across 3 distinct escalating environments.
Right, let's break those down. Section 19A dictates the system of routine accountability during peacetime operations. That's the baseline.
Then Section 19B provides the architecture for authorized violence during armed conflict. It's the controlled application of lethal force.
And then Section 19C establishes the protocol for system isolation, specifically captivity or hostile detention.
The Air Force operates as a closed-loop system of accountability. You must understand the why behind these environments to function within them.
Okay, let's establish the baseline. We begin with Section 19A, Way of Life. The foundational operational requirement established in Air Force Instruction 1.1 is 24/7 compliance.
24/7.
The framework demands that airmen are always subject to duty. This includes weekends, this includes holidays, this includes authorized leave.
The system essentially owns the individual's time and behavior in totality.
Yeah.
The text explicitly dictates that military and civilian airmen are required to comply with prescribed standards of conduct in all official matters, as well as when off duty.
And the justification provided is just entirely pragmatic. The U.S. Air Force mission is critical to national security, global stability, and international relations.
Right, so therefore, the system enforces more restrictive rules and elevated behavioral standards than those found anywhere in the civilian community.
But let's run the calculus on that total ownership for a second. Why does the military care if a technical sergeant, while on leave in a civilian town thousands of miles from a base, commits some minor civil infraction?
The clinical why behind this constant subjugation to standards is operational resilience and public trust.
Public trust.
Yeah. The text notes that accountability is critically important to good order and discipline, but it actually goes further. If a member fails to ensure accountability, the direct consequence is a hindered trust from the American public.
Wow, okay. Because the system relies entirely on the public's perception of its operational integrity.
Exactly. The military is a tool of the state, right? It's funded by the populace, and it's authorized to wield violence on their behalf.
So if the populace loses trust in the discipline of the individuals wielding that violence,
The legitimacy of the entire apparatus just degrades. A violation off duty is not seen as a personal failing. It is treated as a breach of systemic integrity.
the system cannot afford the operational friction generated by public distrust.
Right. Therefore, off-duty behavior is regulated with the exact same intensity as on-duty performance.
Okay, so to mandate this uninterrupted compliance, the system relies on a strict cascading hierarchy of publications. It's governed by DeFi 9160.
And a technical sergeant must be able to classify and interpret these directives.
Let's look at the summit of this hierarchy. We have the DFPD, or Department of the Air Force Policy Directive.
These are overarching orders from the Secretary of the Air Force.
Right. They contain directive policy statements.
Yeah.
They govern, they delegate authorities, and they establish the foundational what of the mission. They do not concern themselves with the minutiae of execution.
Directly beneath the policy directives are the instructions, so the DFIs, AFIs, and SPFIs.
And the text states these instruct readers on specifically what to do.
Exactly. They direct action and ensure compliance to standard operations across the entire department.
I like this analogy. If the policy directive is the strategic command to capture a hill, the instruction assigns the specific units and outlines the timeline for the operation.
That's a perfect way to look at it. Following the instructions are the manuals, DAFMAN, AFMAN, and SPFM. If an instruction dictates what to do, the manual dictates precisely how to do it. Manuals are an extension of the instructions, providing the granular, step-by-step procedures and technical guidance required for performing standard tasks.
And the text specifies that manuals intended for personnel who've graduated from special schools may include highly specialized technical language.
They get very into the weeds.
But I must identify a massive structural anomaly in this publication process.
Oh, yeah.
The text mandates that policy directives and instructions be written clearly and concisely and in a manner that an average air and space professional can understand.
Ah, yes. The average wording.
Let's isolate the word average here. That is a highly subjective, unquantifiable metric.
It really is.
It introduces a dangerous variable into an otherwise rigid compliance structure. The system relies on an assumed baseline of systemic comprehension that cannot be perfectly measured. And the entire weight of this vagueness falls on the shoulders of the mid-level manager. A technical sergeant is expected to bridge the gap between a vaguely defined average comprehension level and the system's absolute demand for strict compliance.
And that vagueness is not just a minor oversight, it's a persistent operational risk. The burden of interpretation falls squarely on leadership.
How so?
Well, the text explicitly assigns leaders the responsibility to ensure members meet the spirit and intent of USAF policy.
So it is not enough to simply follow the mechanical letter of the regulation.
No, the technical sergeant must infer the strategic intent behind the directive and enforce that intent. When the language is vague, the leader must act as the interpretive filter, translating imperfect guidance into flawless execution.
This brings us to a critical point of friction within Section 19A, non-directive publications.
Right.
The text defines these as informational guides, pamphlets, basic doctrine, and handbooks that suggest guidance. The framework explicitly states that complying with publications in this category is expected, but not mandatory.
Which is a very interesting phrasing.
Let's challenge the logic of this categorization for a second. If compliance is not mandatory, it cannot be strictly enforced through direct punitive action under the UCMJ.
Correct.
Think of this like a software terms of service agreement. It is technically optional to accept, but practically, you are required to accept it to function within the software's ecosystem.
That's exactly it.
So how does a technical sergeant accurately explain the difference between expected and mandatory to a subordinate when failing in either category leads to administrative friction?
The clinical distinction really lies in the velocity and nature of the enforcement mechanism.
Okay, unpack that.
So violating a mandatory instruction triggers an immediate codified disciplinary action. The feedback loop is instant and punitive.
Right.
Violating an expected non-directive publication indicates a failure to align with the optimum operational parameters of the system.
So it might not immediately trigger a court-martial.
Exactly, but it degrades the member's performance metrics. It initiates, essentially, an administrative slow bleed.
Over time, failing to meet expected standards leads to administrative separation, loss of promotion potential, or reassignment. It is the difference between a critical system error that instantly crashes the program and a gradual degradation of system efficiency that eventually leads to the component being replaced.
That is a phenomenal way to frame it. So moving from general administrative guidance to specific localized constraints, we have to analyze general orders.
General orders.
The text defines general orders as guidance specifically tailored to maintaining good order and discipline in a deployed setting.
Right.
These orders prohibit or restrict activities that are generally permissible in domestic society. Like a behavior that is perfectly legal on a base in the United States suddenly becomes a punishable offense in a foreign theater.
The analytical why for general orders is geopolitical risk mitigation.
Okay.
The deployed environment introduces variables that are entirely outside the control of the United States military, specifically the culture, the laws, and the sensibilities of the host nation. Right. The text states, these restrictions are necessary to preserve relations with host nations and support military operations with friendly forces.
Strict compliance is the only mechanism the system has to control those external variables.
Consider a hypothetical scenario. A unit is deployed to an allied nation with strict conservative laws regarding public conduct or, alcohol consumption.
Okay.
In the U.S., an off-duty airman consuming alcohol or wearing certain clothing off base is a non-issue. But in this deployed environment, a general order explicitly forbids it.
Right, yeah.
If an airman violates that order, they aren't just breaking a localized rule, they are actively threatening the strategic geopolitical alliance that allows the U.S. military to operate in that region.
Absolutely. A single behavioral failure could result in the host nation revoking basing rights, effectively crippling a regional command.
It's massive, and the consequence of noncompliance reflects the severity of that risk. The text warns that failure to comply with general orders leads directly to adverse administrative action, non-judicial punishment, or criminal prosecution pursuant to the UCMJ.
A technical sergeant must enforce general orders not as arbitrary behavioral constraints, but as essential protocols for preserving international alliances.
You have to explain to a subordinate that their personal freedom is temporarily suspended to maintain the structural integrity of a geopolitical strategy.
Right. You are an instrument of the state.
Exactly. We transition now from the administrative foundation of peacetime compliance to Section 19B, the law of war. This is the architecture of authorized violence.
Yes.
So we've established how the system controls an airman during Tuesday morning office hours.
Right.
But what happens when that administrative structure is dropped into a combat zone? How do peacetime rules mutate into authorized violence?
The text defines the law of war, or the law of armed conflict, as treaties and customary international law binding on the United States that regulate the resort to armed force, the conduct of hostilities, and the protection of war victims.
And the foundational purpose of this architecture is risk containment on a macro scale.
Right. The text states it arises from a humanitarian desire to lessen the effects of conflicts, prevent unnecessary suffering, and keep conflicts from degenerating into savagery and brutality.
Because without the law of war, military force becomes indiscriminate violence.
And indiscriminate violence destroys the systemic professionalism of the combatants, it alienates the global community, and ultimately it undermines the objective of restoring peace.
The system requires controlled violence to achieve its aims. Uncontrolled violence is a systemic failure.
Exactly.
We must establish the absolute legal weight of these regulations. The law of war is not a set of internal military guidelines or suggested best practices.
No, it is not.
The text points out that Article 6 of the United States Constitution states that treaty obligations are the supreme law of the land.
The U.S. Supreme Court holds that international legal obligations enjoy equal status to laws passed by Congress.
That's huge. Therefore, Compliance is an absolute legal mandate for all persons subject to U.S. law, including military personnel and civilian contractors. You are bound by international treaties with the exact same rigidity that you're bound by federal tax law.
The architecture of the law of war is built upon 5 foundational principles.
Let's go through them.
A technical sergeant must possess level B comprehension of these principles to explain the parameters of authorized violence to those tasked with executing it.
So the first principle is military necessity. This principle justifies the use of all measures needed to defeat the enemy as quickly and efficiently as possible, provided those measures are not otherwise prohibited by the law of war.
It is the authorization to destroy.
Yes. Military necessity dictates that attacks must be limited strictly to military objectives. The text defines a military objective as an object which, by its nature, location, purpose, or use, makes an effective contribution to military action, and whose total or partial destruction offers a definite military advantage.
It's a very cold calculus. Does destroying this target advance the mission? If yes, it is a valid objective.
However, a military necessity is immediately counterbalanced by the second principle, humanity.
Right. Humanity forbids the infliction of suffering, injury, or destruction unnecessary to accomplish a legitimate military purpose.
The clinical reality is that once a military purpose has been achieved, inflicting more suffering serves no operational function.
Exactly. It wastes ammunition, destroys discipline, and violates international law.
We must anchor the jargon utilized in the text to vivid, logical extremes to really understand this balance.
Let's do that.
The text uses the term hors de combat, which translates to out of the fight. This occurs when an enemy combatant is incapacitated by being severely wounded or when they've been captured.
Striking a target that is hors de combat is a direct violation of the principle of humanity.
Consider a paratrooper descending to attack a position. They are an active weapon system. Engaging them is authorized under military necessity.
Right, they are a threat.
Now consider a pilot who has ejected from a destroyed aircraft. They are separated from their weapon system. Gravity and the destruction of their aircraft have mathematically neutralized them as a threat. They are hors de combat.
Applying lethal force against that pilot yields zero military advantage. It is an illegal act of savagery.
The third principle is distinction. This imposes an absolute requirement to discriminate between military forces and the civilian population, and between unprotected and protected objects.
Military force may only be directed against military objectives. Civilian objects, such as dwellings, schools, hospitals, and cultural properties, possess protected status. They cannot be targeted.
Yet the text acknowledges a severe, terrifying vulnerability regarding distinction. Civilian objects lose their protected status if they are used to make an effective contribution to military action.
Yes.
The system introduces a dangerous vagueness here with the phrase effective contribution. Just as we saw the vagueness of the average airman in Section 19A, we see subjective interpretation enter the battle space in 19B.
Imagine a civilian factory. It is protected. But intelligence suggests the enemy is using it to store munitions.
The threshold for what constitutes an effective contribution is not mathematically defined in a manual anywhere.
No, it's not. The text dictates that commanders must make decisions in good faith based on the information available to them at the time.
And I must highlight that this information is often imperfect, delayed, or completely lacking. The system forces the commander to execute lethal action based on a subjective assessment, carrying the risk of international war crime prosecution if the assessment is later deemed flawed or based on faulty intelligence.
That inherent risk of targeting leads directly to the fourth principle, proportionality.
Yes, let's talk about proportionality. It's frequently misunderstood by the public.
It really is. People think it's a requirement for equal force, like
Yeah.
a mandate to fight fair. It is not. It is not a mirror. It is a scalpel. The text defines proportionality as the expectation that one must not act in a way that is unreasonable or excessive. It is a calculus that weighs the justification for acting against the expected incidental harms.
The text explicitly states that incidental damage to the civilian population is often inevitable in war.
Yes.
The rule of proportionality does not mandate zero collateral damage, because that is mathematically impossible in a kinetic environment.
It creates an obligation to refrain from attacks where the expected incidental harm would be considered excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated.
A technical sergeant must be able to explain this math. Proportionality is applying the exact wattage of force necessary to cauterize the threat without burning the surrounding tissue.
So if an enemy sniper is firing from the roof of a hospital, proportionality does not mean you cannot return fire.
Right.
It means you cannot level the entire hospital with an airstrike to eliminate a single rifleman. You must use a precision asset to eliminate the threat while preserving the protected structure.
The fifth principle is honor. Honor requires a certain degree of fairness in offense and defense and mutual respect between opposing forces. It forbids conduct that constitutes a breach of trust.
The text specifically prohibits killing or wounding enemy persons by resort to perfidy.
Okay, we must define the jargon. Perfidy. Perfidy is treachery. It involves feigning a protected status to gain a military advantage.
Examples include fighting in the enemy's uniform, misusing the Red Cross or Red Crescent medical signs, or feigning non-hostile relations by waving a white flag of surrender only to open fire when the opposing force approaches.
However, the text clearly states that honor does not forbid parties from using lawful ruses and deceptions.
The technical sergeant must explain this distinction clearly. Tactical camouflage, dummy tanks, and misinformation are lawful ruses. They deceive the enemy's operational awareness.
But utilizing a marked ambulance to transport an assault team behind enemy lines is a war crime of perfidy.
Exactly. It exploits the legal protections of humanity for lethal gain, destroying the trust necessary to eventually negotiate peace.
The application of these 5 principles requires the strict categorization of individuals within the battle space. You cannot apply the calculus of proportionality or distinction if you do not know the legal status of the human in your crosshairs.
You have to know what you're looking at.
Exactly. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 recognized distinct classes of persons. The first class is combatants. These are lawful or privileged participants in hostilities. They are members of the military forces of a state.
Right. To maintain this status, they must wear fixed, distinctive emblems recognizable at a distance. They must carry arms openly, and they must conduct their operations according to the law of war.
Because they comply with the system, combatants possess a special legal status. The text states they have legal immunity from domestic law for acts done under military authority in accordance with the law of war.
If an authorized combatant kills an enemy combatant in battle, it is not murder under civilian law. It is a lawful act of war.
Furthermore, if captured, they have an absolute legal right to prisoner of war status and all the protections that entails.
The second class is non-combatants. These are military personnel who are explicitly not authorized to engage in combatant activities.
The text provides permanent medical personnel and religious chaplains as the primary examples.
Yes, they accompany the armed forces, but they are not weapons. They may not be made the object of attack, and if captured, they are considered retained personnel, not prisoners of war, primarily to minister to the actual prisoners.
The third class is civilians. They are protected persons and may not be directly targeted. However, the text reiterates the grim reality of proportionality. Civilians may suffer injury or death incident to a direct attack on a lawful military objective, provided the attack adheres to the mathematical constraints we discussed earlier.
Right. Furthermore, if a civilian takes an active or direct part in hostilities...
Like if they pick up a rifle and fire at a patrol.
Exactly. They instantly forfeit their protected status and become a lawful target for the duration of their participation.
The text introduces a specific subcategory within civilian populations that requires precise explanation: the levy en masse.
This jargon refers to inhabitants of a non-occupied area who spontaneously participate in a popular uprising to defend against foreign invaders.
Under the Geneva Conventions, these individuals are granted lawful combatant status despite lacking formal military organization or uniforms.
The only requirements are that they carry arms openly and respect the laws and customs of war. It is a rare legal loophole designed to protect citizens defending their homeland from sudden invasion.
Now we must address a critical systemic anomaly. The text introduces a term that breaks the traditional framework: unprivileged belligerent.
Oh, this is vital.
It explicitly acknowledges a vagueness here, stating that this term is not used in the Geneva Conventions. It is a definition created internally by the Department of Defense Law of War Manual.
The DoD defines an unprivileged belligerent as an individual who is not authorized by a state party to a conflict to take part in hostilities, but does so anyway.
So it includes lawful combatants who forfeit their status by engaging in spying or sabotage out of uniform.
Yes, and civilians who forfeit their status by permanently participating in hostilities without meeting the criteria for a levée en masse.
This includes members of international terrorist organizations.
This classification completely strips the individual of the legal immunities granted to lawful combatants and the protections granted to civilians. They operate entirely outside the authorized architecture of violence. They are rogue nodes in the system.
To manage the execution of force against these various classes, the system implements rules of engagement, or ROE.
The ROE?
The text defines ROE as the strict parameters for when, where, how, why, and against whom commanders and airmen may use force. All airmen have a legal, binding obligation to understand and apply these rules. You cannot claim ignorance of the ROE to excuse an unauthorized use of force.
The baseline for all ROE is the inherent right of self-defense.
Right.
The standing rules of engagement clearly state that no rule, policy, or directive limits a commander's inherent authority and obligation to use all necessary means to take appropriate actions in self-defense of their unit.
Furthermore, an individual military member may act in self-defense unless expressly directed otherwise by a unit commander.
But the execution of self-defense is not a blank check for violence.
No, it is constrained by 4 clinical parameters. The first is de-escalation. When time and circumstances permit, forces committing hostile acts must be warned and given the opportunity to withdraw.
The system requires an attempt to avoid the expenditure of lethal force if the threat can be neutralized through deterrence.
The second parameter is necessity. Necessity focuses entirely on the perceived threat. A hostile act must have occurred, or hostile intent must be demonstrated.
The text defines these as force or threats of force used against the United States, its armed forces, designated property, or intended to impede the mission. You cannot fire simply because you feel nervous.
Right, there must be an articulable necessary trigger.
Exactly. The third is proportionality in the specific context of self-defense. Again, this is the scalpel.
The text dictates that U.S. forces may only use the amount of force necessary to decisively counter a hostile act and ensure continued safety. The force used must be reasonable in nature, duration, and scope compared to the threat, based on the facts known at that exact moment.
If a vehicle runs a checkpoint and poses an imminent lethal threat to the guards, disabling the vehicle with kinetic fire is proportional.
Calling in an artillery strike on the entire neighborhood in response is a catastrophic failure of proportionality.
The final parameter of self-defense is pursuit. U.S. forces can pursue and engage a hostile force that continues to commit hostile acts or demonstrate hostile intent.
However, the text notes that specific mission ROEs may heavily restrict pursuit across international borders or into certain territories, subordinating tactical necessity to broader geopolitical strategy. You may have the tactical advantage to pursue, but the strategic directive commands you to halt.
The consequence for failing to accurately apply the law of war and the rules of engagement is absolute.
Yes. The text mandates that members who commit law of war violations may be prosecuted by courts-martial under the UCMJ or through an international military tribunal.
Furthermore, the system dictates an absolute duty to report suspected violations promptly. Complicity through silence is treated as a systemic failure.
If you witness a war crime and do not report it, you are legally culpable for the degradation of the system.
We must now shift our analysis from the authorized application of violence to the protocol for total system isolation. Section 19C covers the code of conduct.
The connection here is vital. If Section 19A is the software for peacetime compliance, and Section 19B is the architecture for executing authorized violence, Section 19C is the behavioral software designed for honorable survival when a member is entirely isolated from the chain of command, captured by the enemy, and operating in a hostile, unregulated environment.
The text establishes immediately that the code of conduct is a moral code, not a criminal one. It is designed to provide a standard of conduct that all members are expected to measure up to when the administrative and legal structures of 19A and 19B collapse.
However, the text issues a critical clinical warning. While violations of the code of conduct are not criminally punishable per se, actions that violate the code almost always simultaneously violate the uniform code of military justice.
A moral failure in the isolation of a prisoner of war camp frequently translates into a legal prosecution upon repatriation.
The system allocates training for this contingency based on a strict mathematical risk assessment. The military does not waste high-level survival training on personnel with a statistically near zero chance of capture.
Right. There are 3 levels of code of conduct training. Level A is entry-level training, representing the minimum understanding needed for all members.
Level B is an enhanced version for service members whose specialties entail a moderate risk of capture, such as ground combat units or security forces.
Level C is the highest tier, reserved for members whose jobs entail a significant or high risk of capture, and whose position makes them vulnerable to greater than average exploitation efforts by the enemy.
The text provides aircrews and special mission forces as the primary examples for Level C.
The Code of Conduct consists of 6 distinct articles. A technical sergeant must possess Level B comprehension to explain the analytical relationships within these articles to their airmen.
Article 1 demands dedication to the United States and preparedness to give one's life in its defense. It states that honorable survival in captivity requires a high degree of dedication and motivation rooted in a strong belief in American democratic institutions. It sets the psychological baseline.
Article 2 addresses the absolute prohibition of voluntary surrender. The text states that a member may never surrender of their own free will. Even when isolated, separated from their unit, and surrounded, their primary operational duty is to evade capture and rejoin the nearest friendly force.
Let us pause and isolate a crucial distinction here. The text uses both the word surrender and the word capture. On paper, to a civilian observer, they look like the exact same outcome. The enemy possesses you. But you are saying the system treats one as mathematically acceptable and the other as a crime. How does a technical sergeant actually explain the difference between surrender and capture to a subordinate?
The distinction lies entirely in agency and mathematical probability. Surrender is defined as the willful act of giving oneself up to the enemy. It is a voluntary submission, while the capacity to resist or evade still exists.
Capture, conversely, is circumstantial.
Exactly. Capture occurs when a member has absolutely no physical means to resist, evasion is definitively impossible, and further fighting would mathematically lead only to the death of the member, with zero significant loss inflicted upon the enemy.
Think of a pilot descending in a parachute into the center of an enemy battalion. Resistance is physically impossible.
Right. Capture, dictated by overwhelming enemy strength and the absolute futility of fighting, is considered mathematically acceptable and not dishonorable. Voluntary surrender, however, is a shameful abandonment of duty and is strictly punishable under the UCMJ.
Once captured, Article 3 activates. The duty to resist enemy exploitation is not lessened by the misfortune of capture.
The text points out a historical reality. Contrary to the intent of the 1949 Geneva Conventions, enemies have consistently treated the prisoner of war compound as an extension of the battlefield.
The captive must view their detention not as a cessation of hostilities, but as a new, highly specialized operational theater where the enemy attempts to extract intelligence or generate propaganda.
Article 3 explicitly forbids accepting parole or special favors from the enemy. A technical sergeant must define a parole agreement.
The text states parole agreements are promises the prisoner makes to the captor to fulfill stated conditions,
such as a promise not to attempt escape or not to bear arms if released.
in exchange for special privileges like lessened restraint or better food. Why does the system strictly prohibit entering into these contractual agreements?
Because it compromises the systemic integrity of the captive population. If one prisoner accepts favors, it creates division, fractures the internal chain of command, and provides the enemy with psychological leverage over the entire group.
Article 4 mandates the maintenance of the military hierarchy within the isolation environment. The system demands that it rebuild itself, even in the void of a prison cell. Officers and enlisted members continue to carry out their responsibilities.
Wherever located, prisoners must organize in a military manner under the senior military person present, regardless of their branch of service. Without this strict discipline, the text warns that camp organization, coordinated resistance, and collective survival are impossible.
Informing on or collaborating against fellow prisoners is categorized as treason and guarantees UCMJ prosecution upon return.
Article V governs the flow of information. This is where the friction between legal theory and psychological reality is most intense.
The text states that when questioned, a prisoner of war is required by the Geneva Conventions to give only their name, rank, service number, and date of birth. Under the conventions, the enemy has no legal right to force a prisoner to provide any additional information.
However, the text acknowledges the clinical reality of long-term captivity. It is psychologically and physically unrealistic to expect a human being to remain confined for years, subjected to interrogation, reciting only those 4 pieces of data.
The code permits communication on matters of health and welfare, filling out generic capture cards, and writing letters home to prove proof of life.
The absolute mandate, however, is to resist and evade all enemy efforts to secure statements or actions that further the enemy's cause. This includes confessions, propaganda recordings, or broadcast appeals for surrender.
The objective is to provide the enemy with as little actionable intelligence or political leverage as mathematically possible. You are no longer trying to shoot the enemy. You are trying to starve them of data.
Article 6 establishes the mechanism of ultimate systemic accountability. A member remains responsible for personal actions at all times.
Upon repatriation, prisoners of war face a comprehensive review of both the circumstances of their initial capture and their conduct during the duration of their detention.
This review is a systems method for auditing the isolated node once it is reconnected to the network. It aims to recognize meritorious performance and resistance, but more importantly, to investigate allegations of misconduct, collaboration, or yielding to parole agreements.
Now, we must analyze a massive operational pivot introduced at the very end of Chapter 19. The text addresses operations other than war, or OTW, and the detention of personnel by unfriendly governments or terrorist groups.
This represents a complete paradigm shift. In OTW, the Geneva Conventions do not apply. The authorized architecture of violence and the legal protections of a prisoner of war vanish entirely.
If detained by an unfriendly government during OETW, the captive is subject strictly to the domestic criminal laws of the detaining nation. The system mandates that the detainee maintain military bearing and avoid aggressive or illegal behavior. They must immediately ask to see U.S. Embassy personnel.
The most critical directive here is regarding evasion. Earlier, we established that a POW must constantly try to escape. Here, the text states that attempting to escape from a peacetime government confinement facility is not recommended by DoD policy except under life-threatening circumstances.
Why? Because an escape attempt violates local criminal law and subjects the captives to increased domestic criminal prosecution, severely complicating the U.S. government's diplomatic efforts to secure their legal release.
The operational logic shifts even further and becomes incredibly volatile when analyzing a terrorist hostage scenario.
The text dictates a clinical pivot. Terrorists do not adhere to state laws. They do not adhere to international conventions. They are the definition of the unprivileged belligerent we discussed in 19b.
Because the environment is entirely unregulated and the captor is unconstrained by law, DoD policy completely shifts away from the strict, defiant military bearing of Article V. The mandate changes to rapport building.
The terrorist hostage must actively work to humanize themselves in the mind of the captor. The objective is to establish themselves as a complex human being, rather than a stereotypical, faceless symbol of the United States military.
Why? To lessen the mathematical probability of indiscriminate execution. The unprivileged belligerent sees you as a prop. You must force them to see you as a person.
The text explicitly recommends staying away from topics that could inflame sensibilities, such as politics or religion. The member must not argue, patronize, or debate issues with the terrorists. You submit to their control to manipulate their perception of your value.
We must connect the mechanisms across these three sections to understand the holistic chain of accountability the system requires a technical sergeant to comprehend.
Section 19A builds the foundation. It establishes the rigid habit of following orders, understanding the flow of directives from policy to manual, and maintaining compliance 24/7. This is the baseline programming of the Airman. It teaches the node to accept the system's absolute authority.
Section 19b takes that baseline programming and applies it to authorize violence. It creates the legal framework for war. It demands that the airmen execute lethal force precisely according to the rules of engagement and the principles of necessity, distinction, and proportionality. It is the controlled, mathematical application of violence governed by international law.
Section 19C acts as the ultimate contingency plan. When the administrative frameworks of 19A and the legal protections of 19B collapse entirely due to capture, 19C provides the behavioral software to survive.
The connection between the unprivileged belligerent, defined in 19b, and the hostage protocols of 19c is crucial. The system identifies the threat in one manual and scripts the survival guide in the other.
Because terrorists operate outside the Geneva Conventions, classifying them as unprivileged belligerents, the captured airman cannot rely on the legal protections of Article V. Reciting name, rank, and service number to a terrorist organization is not just an ineffective protocol, it is likely a fatal one.
The Airmen must dynamically recognize the collapse of the legal framework and instantly shift to the DoD OOTW hostage guidelines
Rapport building and humanization.
in order to survive.
We also see a stark contrast between proactive and retroactive auditing across the text. Section 19A and 19B rely heavily on the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The UCMJ is the legal punisher. It is enforced proactively by the system's hierarchy.
If you violate a general order, the system punishes you immediately. If you violate proportionality, the system prosecutes you.
The Code of Conduct in Section 19C, however, is a moral guide operating in a void. Because the member is isolated, the system cannot proactively enforce compliance. It can only audit the member's moral adherence retroactively during the repatriation review.
Translating this Level B comprehension for a technical sergeant yields 3 primary actionable takeaways that must be internalized and explained to subordinates.
Takeaway 1 is the logic of standards. A technical sergeant must articulate that regulations, specifically general orders in Section 19A, are not arbitrary administrative burdens designed to annoy personnel. They are the bedrock of mission success.
You must explain that a general order in a deployed environment is a legally binding constraint designed precisely to protect strategic geopolitical relations. A failure to comply is a failure of national strategy.
Takeaway 2 is the math of proportionality. A technical sergeant must be capable of explaining that proportionality in war and self-defense under Section 19B is a strict calculus. It is the scalpel, not the mirror.
It is about applying the exact, precise wattage of force necessary to decisively neutralize the hostile threat without inflicting excessive incidental harm on civilians or protected objects. Miscalculating this equation results in international war crimes and the degradation of the system's global legitimacy.
Takeaway 3 is the reality of captivity. You must explain that the Code of Conduct in Section 19C is engineered to prevent a captured airman from being weaponized against the United States. In captivity, the operational objective shifts completely.
The goal is no longer to inflict kinetic damage upon the enemy. The goal is to deny the enemy a geopolitical asset, whether that asset is actionable intelligence, a forced confession, or propaganda material. Honorable survival is defined by successfully denying the enemy that leverage, even at the cost of your own comfort.
In conclusion, Chapter 19 of Air Force Handbook 1 functions as the ultimate behavioral algorithm of the Air Force. It is a comprehensive, rigid system designed to program an airman's actions across every conceivable environment.
From the mundane administrative duties of the office, to the lethal execution of the battlefield, to the utter isolation of the prison cell, the system demands total compliance, precise violence, and unbreakable resistance.
Yet we leave you with a final, unaddressed systemic paradox derived directly from the text of this audit. Section 19A mandates that leaders must ensure members meet the absolute spirit and intent of USAF policy, maintaining elevated standards and rigid military bearing at all times.
Yet Section 19C dictates survival strategies in terrorist captivity, an environment entirely devoid of rules, governed exclusively by unprivileged belligerents.
If the ultimate test of any system is how it functions when completely isolated from its power source, consider this friction. How does an airman maintain the rigid spirit and intent of Air Force policy while actively complying with the DoD directive to strip away their military identity, humanize themselves, build rapport, and submit to the control of a terrorist?
The system demands absolute, unyielding adherence to its structure. Right up until the exact moment, it demands absolute shape-shifting adaptability to survive the void.
That is the operational paradox inherent in the human weapon.
Yeah.
You are equipped with the analytical framework to navigate it. The audit is complete. Apply the logic.